Yeah.
And you can
They can do fish fry.
Delta to Paris and then Air France to Cairo. Then you do the public show in an hour to go to Luxor, which is the only other place.
Like to welcome everyone to the May 7th, 2025 Cottonwood Heights Planning Commission work session. For the business session at 6 o'clock today, we have 4 items and that we're going to talk about here as well. One is a public hearing and potential action for a conditional use permit to operate a church on Bengal Boulevard. The next is general plan amendment from a request by Adam Nash for land use map amendment, then a zoning map amendment, and then talking about another zoning text amendment on work life. So, okay, Mike, I'll
Okay,
turn it over to you.
thank you. We'll just run through them in order here, if that's all right.
Sure.
Also, while I pull that up, that we will have an alternate planning commission member that was recently appointed. He just needs to get through training and all that, but he should be ready to join by June. His name is Rusty Lugo. So he should be joining one of our next meetings as an alternate member.
Great.
He's a great human too. Really
Good.
great human.
Good. yeah, we're excited to have a full commission. again.
Yeah, I think awesome.
Okay. Our first application tonight is CUP 25004. This is the Wells Fargo property. We discussed a, redevelopment project a couple months ago. That application was withdrawn. We've received a new application for a conditional use permit to operate a church on that site. Not proposing any sort of substantial redevelopment of the site, but using the existing lot and building, just with some minor remodels on the interior. It's about half an acre property. The applicant is Bento Viana. He represents the church, which is known as the Beneficent Spiritus Center Neo de Vegetal. I don't know if I said that right, but I think I was close. But UDV is the acronym that church goes by. Again, proposing to utilize the existing site with only minor modifications. Probably not going to say Wells Fargo on it when all is said and done. And then modifying the drive-through ATM kind of canopy and that space under there, and then mostly interior remodel work.
So it won't need to be reviewed by.
No, and it's not in the Gateway Overlay District, so that review wouldn't trigger. And even full site plan review, that would trigger for planning commission if there were site changes going on, but then a minor work like this doesn't trigger that need. We are recommending, and I sent you a memo just I think yesterday on this continuation of this, just to address a few late changes made to that application. Just some background quickly. This is in the neighborhood commercial zone. Churches are specifically allowed as a conditional use within that zone. The site is established, no new development is proposed. So any new changes proposed, we run through and review for code compliance. So anything new that they do has to meet code. The use has to get approved. Anything existing though, that was existing in a legal fashion is allowed to remain. So it becomes, if anything is non-compliant with today's ordinance, but it's already existing, it becomes legal non-conforming. So where they're not doing full site redevelopment, not every development standard is triggered here in terms of compliance with the neighborhood commercial code. The church use is a formally recognized religious nonprofit. It's been established and recognized as such in the U.S. So it is an official church use. Some of the details of the proposed church itself. Gatherings are held twice a month, the first and third Saturday of each month, from 8 p.m. to just after midnight. And then the potential for 1 to 2 additional gatherings per month as decided upon by the congregation leadership. Those additional gatherings would be either on weekday evenings or kind of midday Sunday, and that's all in the applicant's narrative. Total congregation size is 47 members. They expect 40 to 45 is pretty typical for any given gathering. And then per the narrative, they've stated much of the congregation is families that are living in the area. Likelihood that not every single congregation member is driving their own vehicle. You've got family carpooling, obviously. The site details shown here are what was originally submitted that have been updated, and I'll show you that in a subsequent slide. But again, they're utilizing the existing site with no major changes proposed to circulation, parking layout, the dumpsters, the trash receptacles are as they are today. There are 14 parking stalls that are painted as actual parking stalls, and then the potential to utilize some of the space under that drive-through canopy to accommodate a couple more stalls likely on site. Their original application was then to utilize some of the stalls in the Brighton Point Shopping Center across the street for some overflow use by the church leadership to park there if needed. So they had a total of 21, stalls proposed between the site and the shopping plaza. And I'll go over what the code would require if this church were built today as we get into our analysis. This is the amendment we received. This was received after business hours on Monday, so I'm including it here. We have not had a chance to fully review it and weigh in, and we haven't done any of that yet, which is part of our recommendation for continuation. it was communicated to us that they don't believe now that they can procure, the ability to use the Brighton Point Shopping, Plaza as overflow parking. So their revised plan, again, contingent upon review, shows, the potential for 4 stalls underneath that, parking canopy. They've also identified, the room along Bengal Boulevard within the public right of way that could accommodate on-street parking. We can't look at that as meeting the minimum parking requirement because on-street public parking can't be reserved for one use over another. It's open to any member of the public as long as they're parking in a legal manner. So they did show a lot of space for that, although we don't consider that as part of determining parking compliance. Again, a lot of our initial review, analysis, and actual conditions of approval that we recommended to the commission were based on that old plan. And having received the change so late, we didn't have time to update that review and update our recommendations, which is the primary reason for our revised recommendation to just table this to give time to do that review. Land use authority in this case, this is a conditional use permit. The planning commission is the final land use authority in these matters. We've gone over this a lot. I'll just touch on it quickly. Conditional uses are entitled to approval. They shall be approved. Any detrimental impacts can be reasonably mitigated with reasonable conditions that would mitigate those impacts. On top of that, this is a little bit unique, is the Utah Religious Land Use Act. And derived from state code here, it just states essentially that government may not impose or implement a land use regulation in a manner that imposes a substantial burden on a person's free exercise of religion, unless the burden is in furtherance of a compelling government interest and is the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling government interest. In reading this and kind of comprehending this, we just need to focus on the actual site impacts, the conditional use type analysis and ensure that any conditions being imposed or recommended are the most reasonable given these parameters. And likely not, we wouldn't recommend making any conditions regarding like hours of operation or methodology of operation or anything like that, but more on the, parking and traffic, the standard kind of development impacts that we look at. Segueing right into that, we've identified kind of 2 primary potential detrimental impacts that would warrant analysis under the conditional use authority. We'll say overall, the daily impact of this use proposed is very, very minimal because they're using it generally twice a month. However, a church use, your full congregation comes together all at once. And so the full impact of that use is felt very sparingly, but in its totality, during those first and third Saturdays where the whole congregation is on site. So the proposed use itself is infrequent, but when it does take place, it takes place during typical quiet hours in the city. To mitigate that impact, the applicant has proposed 2 mitigations. This is right in their narrative. Require back-in parking on that northern parking row so that headlights aren't shining north into the neighborhood. They're shining south towards Bengal Boulevard and the building. And then minimizing and managing, pre and post-service outdoor gathering and conversation. Basically when you're arriving to a service, you park and you go in, and then when you leave, you exit the building and you're on your way. And then we have just noted, it's not in their narrative or in their proposal, but any additional site lighting or anything like that would be subject to the city's outdoor lighting ordinance, which we do feel has pretty good parameters for hours and brightness and shielding and things like that would otherwise be a concern to review. And then on top of all that, all other noise and light ordinance, nuisance ordinance guidelines would be applicable here and could be enforced if there were issues. That being said, staff, after reviewing this, finds that if the applicant implements their mitigations here, that does reasonably mitigate the impact of those things. And then the other one, parking and traffic. Traffic generation itself, not a huge concern here. It operates, again, sparingly and in kind of the off hours of general peak traffic. So parking was looked at as kind of the primary concern if the congregation is 47 members, and there's only, 21 parking stalls on that site. That's kind of the impact we looked at fairly closely. If this were building from the ground up, a brand new development, the city's parking manual requires it directs parking for churches in a number of ways. You can do it per square footage, you can do it per seats, you can do it per attendee. Typically, we use the most reasonable standard there, giving the applicant the most benefit. And that would be about half a stall per attendee. So if we average that out, that would require about 24 total parking stalls for a brand new church, building a new site, doing a full redevelopment. The original proposal was 20 to 21. It was still a little light on that. However, the likelihood is that, there would be on average slightly more than 2 people in any given car if you've got families, riding to services together. One thing to note, in our parking ordinance, it states off-street parking shall be provided according to standards noted in this chapter for all newly constructed buildings, and additional parking shall be provided for any structure or use that is expanded. Neither of those things is technically happening here. The building's existing, they're not expanding the structure. The use is different, but it's not expanded beyond the previous use. So this does not automatically trigger having to provide additional parking, which means we're looking at it under the purview of detrimental effects, the conditional use land use authority process, rather than a straight, hey, you're applying, you automatically have to provide more parking. In addition, there's a provision in our off-street parking ordinance that says parking requirements may deviate from standards when the city's DRC or planning commission determine that the deviation meets the intent of the chapter. That's kind of a catch-all for, this type of application for uses that don't neatly fit into that ITE parking manual category. Typically what we do in that case is work with an applicant or a developer, have them provide some sort of study or specific justification from a qualified professional that justifies a deviation from the normal parking rate. That's certainly what we would recommend in this case, in working with them and bringing that back to you before we make a final recommendation as to whether the shortage, 20, 21 parking stalls is adequate for this type of use. So again, no new expansion or development is proposed. It's not an automatic trigger to just require additional parking. However, and then on top of that, the on-street parking that they've shown that can be accommodated, they're not wrong there, but it's public. It's not allowed to count towards the minimum parking standard for this use specifically, because we can't guarantee that those stalls are always available for this use specifically. There are certain areas of the city where on-street parking can count towards the minimum parking standard, but that's in our gateway overlay areas, which is Highland Drive, Fort Union, 1300 East. So there are some areas in the city that allows the Architecture Review Commission to say, there's some circumstances here where we can allow on-street parking to count towards their minimum parking. An example of that would be the Pilates studio and dental office over on Highland Drive on the frontage road, just north of the Whole Foods Shopping Center. They received that waiver a number of years ago, but we don't see that very much. This area is not in the Gateway Overlay District, so that process is not applicable here. That leads us to our recommendation to staff. The nature of this use is such that average daily impact is minimal, but all regular gatherings will generate the highest possible parking impact. As such, the potential impact of a parking shortage is a reasonably anticipated detrimental impact. And without the guarantee or consent for adjacent overflow parking, staff feels that additional analysis and review would be warranted to determine a reasonable allowable parking reduction. That really is the only major concern we have at this point, is just working with the applicant to get some additional analysis or justification that this site can support a full congregation and not lead to overflow parking that's not approved, whether in the adjacent church meeting house or in the shopping center. They have proposed that they will prohibit parking on Oak Shadow Circle. It's a public right of way, but in their narrative, they've proposed that would be prohibited, which leaves the only overflow parking, on Bengal Boulevard. Yeah.
Have they had any conversation with the LDS church about that
That's unclear. I don't know. We could ask them that tonight.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at it, that would be an obvious place
Sure.
where if I was attending and there was no parking, I'd look at that parking.
Yeah, it's
place.
a huge parking lot, sure. So staff's recommendation based on that, while the overall use is compliant with neighborhood commercial ordinance, noise and light concerns are reasonably mitigated by the applicant's proposed conditions and adherence to local codes and ordinances. We do recommend continuing this one more meeting to give time to do that specific analysis to make sure that the site can handle a full, that 47 member congregation's worth of parking impact on the site.
47 is a pretty specific number too. Do they have any reason to think it's gonna stay at that number?
I
I mean,
don't
if they
know. It's a good
expand,
question, yeah.
like churches like to
Yeah.
do, it might be a lot more than that.
It's a good question. So we've got model motions here, but that's our recommendation for you tonight. Happy to answer any questions.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Probably not relevant, but are they a tenant or owner?
I believe a tenant.
Okay,
They provided owner's consent from the property owner, so I believe, and we could ask them again, but at least initially, they will be leasing that site
Okay.
from the owner.
what about signage, future signage? Would that ever be a,
Sure, we have a sign code. Our sign code most commonly allows wall signs and monument signs.
Mhm.
Not like Brighton Point across the street that has that big one,
Right.
it's like a 4 or 5 foot height limitation, just a little kind of monument sign. Those both require building permits, so they go through that process.
okay, if they were to, there are two, I think, two wall mounted signs
Mhm.
currently
Mhm.
facing Bingo.
Yeah.
Yeah, two, one bigger, one smaller.
Yep.
Can they change that?
Yep.
Okay. If they put in a monument sign further closer to the street, that'd require,
That has to go on their property,
Sure.
so on their
Yeah,
side of the
yeah.
sidewalk, but a wall sign or a monument sign, there's setbacks and size and height and lighting standards that apply to all those things.
okay,
And that all goes through building permit.
okay. They have a basement? Just out of
I
curiosity.
don't know, that's a good question.
They can also use this other sign here, can't they?
Yeah, yes, and non-conforming signs, if the business hasn't been vacant for over a year, they could come in and you can use those signs.
It's their sales sign.
What's
What's
the
the current
I
occupancy
think
of the
it is.
building?
Like,
Occupancy?
As far as, I mean, fire occupancy,
Hmm.
what is the max level that? you can
I
fit?
don't know, I'm not sure.
Just from an expansion standpoint, to what Commissioner Smith had mentioned. If it's 47 or they grow 10% a year or shrink or have events there.
Yeah.
If it has a occupancy to 100, parking is a different situation. So I guess that's a question that I would ask is,
Sure.
what is current occupancy, fire code occupancy for that space? When they max it out,
Good
what's that going to be?
Sure.
So.
I hate to see vacant parking lots in our city. We have so many of them that are used. It seems like a good conversation with their neighbors next door might facilitate this because it's unlikely they're gonna bump into each other given the times of business. But
Yeah.
Anything that we can do to facilitate the two adjacent property owners, and it's not our business.
I
They
would
need to
say,
reach out.
given the flexibility in the off-street parking standards where we as a staff, as part of the development review committee and you as planning commission can approve deviations. I think that encourages where possible, sharing parking. So just to your point, we're not building excess parking just for the sake of meeting a number, but we're building it to suit a use and the impact of it. So that's what I would say is regardless of if it's the church next door or the shopping center across the street, is that, from 8 to midnight, that's not gonna be busy either. We have a mechanism that allows that if they can negotiate that.
Have we, I don't know that I saw, public comments on this. Did we get any feedback? from the neighbors?
We have not received any on this.
Okay, but we noticed them.
This was all, noticed
In
and
the same
mailed out
manner.
2 weeks in advance and
Okay,
posted
great.
everywhere.
I hope we hear from those neighbors tonight and see where they're at.
Sure, yeah.
Any other questions? We can continue to deliberate or if more come up, and we'll have the applicants there as well.
Yeah, I guess one question, is there going to be like a shared use agreement that we have to approve as a city for parking?
So in those circumstances, we would ask that, and this was one of our conditions, they provide written consent
Okay,
of the ability to use overflow parking.
okay,
So we accepted their plan and then said, okay, our analysis and recommendation is based on this plan, but you have to provide consent that you've got permission to do that.
But are you talking about about street overflow parking?
no, it'd be
Oh,
more
we were
so
talking
just
about-
shared
okay,
use,
shared
yeah,
use.
our certification of shared use with
Yeah.
either the next door neighbor across the street.
Yeah, and we typically don't dictate what that agreement needs to look like. We'd have our city attorney review it when it's submitted to make sure it addresses, the things we need, but, easements or agreement, there can be a number of different documents that satisfy that requirement.
Right.
We don't have it yet.
Right.
Okay. We'll carry on then. The next application, for those that have been here a few years, will be familiar. This is ZMA 25002. This is 3526 Fort Union Boulevard. This is technically two applications. That's why it's two agenda items, but it's the same project number. We'll present it as one. This is a land use map amendment from residential office to residential medium density, and a zone map amendment or a rezone from R18 to R28. No, we're going the wrong way. Okay. This is a property on Fort Union. You actually can't get to this property right now. It's right where the water district's repairing their pipeline. So it's physically, blocked off on both sides, but 3526 Fort Union Boulevard, just under an acre in size. The property owner is Land Development LLC, represented by the applicant, Adam Nash. The request here is to amend the land use map, which is in the city's general plan. That's kind of our long-term projection for how we want to see land developed over time, kind of into the future, forward facing. That's a policy more than an actual ordinance, but that's our vision. That land use designation shows a residential office as being the future land use designation for this property. The applicant is proposing to amend that from residential office to a residential medium density designation instead. And in a minute, I'll go over the differences between those. And then the zone map, and zoning is the laws that apply on the property today. That dictates how you can use a property and what development standards must be applied to it when you build today. So that's the law as it applies on the land currently. That's currently R18. It's a single family residential, just our typical single family residential zone. Each lot in that zone must be at least 8,000 square feet. And then there's a bunch of other development standards to go along with that for lot width and building height and setbacks and all that. They're proposing to amend that to R28, which actually has very similar standards in terms of lot size and setbacks and heights and things like that, but would allow for, instead of a single family dwelling on each 8,000 square foot lot, it would allow a two-family dwelling, a twin home, a duplex, a two-unit building on each 8,000 square foot lot. Staff's recommendation is approval. So this is the land use map. Again, the future facing kind of future policy where, where the city's plan envisions this area being in the future. The left is the current land use map. You can see it's residential office. Nearby, you've got residential medium density adjacent to it, a couple other parcels with that long range designation of residential office as well, and some utility designation in the area. And then on the right is what this would look like if amended to the residential medium density. All of the yellow or the kind of lighter tan color is residential low density. So single family residential. Why does it keep jumping me back here? Just wants us to talk about this. I'm sorry. Okay, zoning. Again, zoning laws that guide and govern use and development today. This area is predominantly in the R18 zone. You can see the random mixed use project down the street. I believe that's the gear room. The gear room kind of ski shop there. So that has a mixed use zoning today. And then everything else has a current zoning of single family residential, except across the street, obviously you've got public facility zoning. One note here directly adjacent to this property is zoned single family residential, but there's an existing development that has two twin homes on it. They've been there since the late seventies.
Those are zoned R18.
They're zoned R18, yep. So, in the general plan, the guidance for residential medium density land use is a typical density of 6 to 10 units per acre, typically containing townhome and condominium type developments, as well as higher density, single family dwelling neighborhoods, like an R16 or even lesser. You know, if you had smaller lot sizes, your density per acre would actually approach 6 to 10 units. Being 1 acre and, you know, kind of doing the preliminary math on this just conceptually, it appears the maximum amount of lots you could get out of this parcel in either zone would be 3. So that would correspond in the R28 zone with 6 total units, 3 as it's zoned today for single family. So definitely on the lower end of that residential medium density land use, but still in that category. The zoning then, R28, allows the applicant to construct not only single family homes, but also 2 family homes. And their intent would be to construct 3 2-family structures, twin homes on this acreage. The development standards in the R28 zone, again, very similar to that of the R18 zone, which is what it is today. 8,000 square foot minimum lot size, same exact as R18. 65-foot minimum lot width. R18, I think, is 70, so just a little bit different there. 35-foot maximum building height, exactly the same as R18. 25 feet front and 20-foot rear setbacks, which is the same as R18. And then 15 feet of total side yard between the 2 sides, with neither being less than 5. That's a little different than R18, because in R18, it's a 20-foot total side yard with neither less than 8. So slightly less side setbacks, slightly less lot width, but otherwise pretty comparable to the development standards in the R18 zone. Some background on this. In 2019, there was a general plan amendment that was initiated by the city. Most of this area, this kind of eastern third of Fort Union Boulevard, used to have a long-range land use designation of mixed use, which is a fairly intensive commercial, mixed use zoning tool. The council at the time directed staff, and I think this was based on some public input, that maybe that was a little more intense of a land use vision than the city desired. So the city initiated an amendment to that. It's kind of hard to see on there. You kind of see it on the TV that the parcels outlined in blue all carried a mixed use designation prior to 2019. So from city incorporation to 2019, all the blue parcels were mixed use feature designation. In 2019, they were amended as shown, and this is what it is today. So the dark purple there is residential office, and then a lot of it was scaled back to either medium density or low density. This application has been brought forward before through the process, actually 2 different times. There was an initial application to rezone the property to residential office, which corresponds with the land use designation. In 2022, that was approval was recommended by staff and the planning commission. That was denied by the city council. Very shortly after that, the applicant made this identical request, the same land use and the same zone change request. Same result, supported by staff, by the planning commission, denied by the city council. The ordinance requires a minimum of at least 1 year before making a new application on the same property. So, you know, we're 3 years past that now. So they're back again with that same request.
Can you tell us why the city council was not in favor of this?
There's a quote of health and safety.
Yeah, I mean, there's just some general findings were provided. I didn't go back and listen to the minutes of the meeting, so I hesitate to speculate too much on their findings, but those denial ordinances were attached and there's some general findings in there. So in 2022, after those denials happened, the applicant did move forward with a 3-lot single family subdivision and actually took this all the way through the entitlement process to where even today there is a final subdivision plat that could be recorded, which would create the 3 lots. But the subdivision plat is what's taken to the Salt Lake County recorder, and once that's recorded, that parcel would be subdivided from one large parcel into three smaller parcels. That exists. The applicant also made numerous public improvements to the site, curb, gutter, sidewalk, some utility upgrades, I believe, were made. So they've done some work on that. Did site demolition and kind of cleaned up the property from the previous condition, but never has recorded that 3-lot single family subdivision. I'm showing this as the applicant's concept plan, but I want to caveat that if a rezone or a zone change were to happen, they do not have to move forward with this exact plan. That would be subject to a subsequent subdivision and permit review. But their concept plan, at least what they're thinking right now, would be to, if the rezone was approved, to utilize the private driveway on the east side of the parcels here to create a rear entry kind of development where those 3 units would be accessed from the rear rather than from Fort Union Boulevard. This would require full design review by the city and would require permission, by whoever owns that private driveway. But this is the concept that they shared with us. Very similar in lot size and layout to what the subdivision plat is today, just with twin homes instead of single family. And then, working towards a rear entry type product.
Can that shared driveway, I didn't realize it was not on the property.
The shared driveway here is,
Oh.
that is, but to get to that shared driveway, they would have to use that access road to the east.
But that's not a public road.
That's not, that's privately owned. So same thing, they would just need to, whoever owns that, they would need to determine who owns that and what type of approval would be needed to utilize that. That road services, I believe, the 4 twin homes that exist there today.
It does.
Interesting.
So they would have to negotiate for a driveway easement?
For access,
Yeah.
cross access to be able to use that driveway, yeah.
Okay,
And now alternatively, they could build driveways along Fort Union Boulevard. We have driveway standards in our code.
mhm.
Whether single family or 2 family, there are driveway standards for how wide they can be, how close they can be from property lines. That is a right available to them as well.
On the pictures that they have on the property currently, it shows the driveway access from Fort Union. It doesn't show that.
Sure, well, yeah, and
It's
today,
a little bit different concept.
today it's single family. And
Yeah.
my guess is they've been marketing it as a 3-lot, single family development, which was, I don't think they were talking about. And this is the plat, there's no rear entry here. So the single family concept would be access directly into Fort Union. And I don't want to be misleading, the 2 family component could as well. This is just the concept that they've shown they're pursuing here.
Is there any known opposition?
Yes,
Yes.
we got 2 comments and then I've received a couple calls. I think you'll hear from some of the nearby neighborhood
Later,
today.
okay.
Mike, is there any idea about putting things, orienting them the way they are, the access in the back versus the front, the north versus the south?
From an access management standpoint, I think consolidating conflict points, eliminating that off of Fort Union is a great thing to pursue. It's not guaranteed. I don't know that we can mandate that because that shared driveway is not a public access, but I would love to see that happen from just a pure access management standpoint.
I mean, it solves a small flag lot situation by making it a legit access to.
Sure. Yeah.
That it's a narrow lane and it's a little blind, so just depending on where things land, just from the staff standpoint,
Yeah.
accessible or visibility, all the rules, like just
So
as we
yeah,
talked about those improvements, this is a new iteration than what we saw
Yeah.
a few years ago, and some of those things beyond the curb and gutter, I'm imagining that Adam would lean into that just to try to make this and figuring out that agreement, the road is not in great shape. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as it currently sits, it's got a few little potholes and it's aged.
Yeah.
And, it's not, this will significantly increase the traffic. So those guys obviously have to work it out between the 2 of them.
of course. You'll talk in the business meeting. Adam, yeah. So that would be part of, the fire department will need to look at this, if that can support adding additional traffic to it, if the condition's fair, and then, that would all be part of that subsequent process. So it's not a guarantee, but it is the concept they're pursuing. This would also require you know, they couldn't use the same subdivision plat because they would have to accommodate that shared driveway in the rear, so they'd go through a new subdivision process, which would then trigger, you know, Public Works and Engineering review for frontage improvements and, you know, anything else that's changed between the original subdivision and now.
So based on the renderings, and these are obviously super basic, is the anticipation to max out the 35 feet? And what's the distance on the west measure to the property line? Do you have any?
They haven't shown, although the height, I have no idea. The
Agreed.
concept here is showing the smaller setback. You know, that 5 foot R28 setback being on the east side of the lot and the larger one being on the west.
Okay.
Right here. Again, we can't hold them to that, but that's, you know, that's what this concept reflects, is their interior setbacks between the units is where they would bunch those together, and then the exterior setbacks would be a little wider.
Any feel for what the contact point is? Is there any new ideas in terms of what that would look like in terms of fencing and that, I think that interface,
Yeah, nothing discussed, you know, right now in the front yard, you know, these would still be addressed on Fort Union, so that would be their functional, you know, or your, you know, their legal front yard, whether, even though they're accessed from the rear. But, you know, normal fencing standards would be 4 feet in that front yard area, and then that can go up to 6 feet. As soon as you hit that front setback all the way around the site, you could have a 6 foot fence. You can apply for even greater than that. You can apply for up to 8 and actually 12 if the neighbors are on board with it. So, all things that are options, that he could pursue. And again, that applies regardless of zoning. That applies today with R18, same thing applies to R2.
Is there any way for us to work through whether it be a maintenance agreement on this site or an HOA requirement for an approval like this, just to maintain the grounds? I know with a lot of these multifamilies, you know, you can have, it's hit or miss when it's multiple ownership versus
Yeah.
one single ownership, just from just the pleasantry of the
yeah.
neighborhood.
So this is a legislative application. This is just the rezone. So, you know, if this got approved, again, this is their intent, but they could come in with something completely different. And then that's a 3-lot subdivision, so that doesn't come back for planning commission approval. I will say for R28 or developments that have condominium plats or common space, you know, common areas like that, we do, as part of our review, just ask for how they're gonna maintain that.
Yeah.
So it's a review requirement, but not one that would come back to planning commission, and not one that is appropriate for the rezone phase of the process. And they have options. They could do, you know, you could own the footprint and have common, you know, space around that. They could subdivide, you know, 3 8,000 square foot lots, and then they could go in and actually split ownership down the middle of those. You know, there are some options there. So our analysis here, just to justify our recommendation, the R28 zoning / medium density land use designation is not more intense than the current future land use designation. Residential office allows for single and 2 family homes, but it also allows for neighborhood scale office buildings and, you know, studios and actual commercial uses. So R28 is kind of a step down in, you know, maximum intensity from that. The adjacent property has residential medium density and RO land use designation. And then the direct adjacent property to the east is already developed as multifamily twin home structures, has been since the late 70s. And then the development impacts, the actual impact of building on this property is actually fairly comparable between R28 and R18. Some fluctuations in minimum setbacks, talking 3 foot difference in that, as in the minimum setback. Same building height, very similar lot standards, coverage standards, everything like that. So the physical impact of this won't be drastically different between R18 and R28. And again, traffic and density impact between R18 and R28 on this site, where there's, you know, we're pretty locked into three lots here. That impact is fairly minimal. Fort Union's a huge road with a ton of capacity. Obviously, any development is looked at for visibility and access and driveway location and all of that. Sharing driveways helps that problem, but none, R18 or R28 is not enough to warrant, you know, full, you know, road reconfiguration or anything like that. And one thing that is a little different between the original denial and now is state code has changed to allow accessory dwelling units in every single family residential zone as a permitted use. Our city code does not allow that in R2A. So if we're looking at maximum impact, this is just a theoretical analysis. 3 single-family homes could be constructed, and then each of those 3 homes could operate an ADU within them, whether now or in the future. So you could have a potential impact of 6 families in 3 single-family homes today, which is the same impact, a different built pattern, a different, building type as the R2A zone, but, same amount of people, whether R18 with an ADU or R2A.
Just as a reminder, there were a couple of illegal rentals in that property before this all was taken down. So in terms of the volume of people that were living there, there were a number of people living on this property, so.
Sure. And then, short-term rentals, that's come up in a few phone calls. Current ordinance, city code does not allow short-term rentals on these properties because they front on a public right of way. That could change, but currently today you would not be eligible to operate a short-term rental in either zone on these properties.
What constitutes short-term?
Less than 30 consecutive days. So our recommendation is approval. That's consistent with our previous recommendations. We've got model motions here. If and when you vote on this, you are making recommendations on both of these to the city council. And we'll have you do that as 2 separate motions. Any questions on this?
Anything further? No?
Okay.
Thanks, Mike.
With our last 15 or so minutes, we've come back and done a little update on the live work text amendment based on the previous discussion. Let me open that up here. It's in a separate document. Bless you. So at our last meeting, we had proposed, very narrow focus of strictly defining live work spaces. And there were some very good points of feedback brought up and how that might fall short and still lead us down a road of loopholes and unintended consequences when utilizing that neighborhood commercial zone. So we've gone back and made some recommendations based on that previous discussion. One being there were a bunch of residential oriented uses allowed as conditional uses in the neighborhood commercial zone. So there's some concern that we could land, live, work and define that where we want, but someone could come in and use one of those other unclear provisions as a loophole to get around it and propose a project that doesn't line up with the purpose statement of the neighborhood commercial zone, which I think we've agreed on, and there's general consensus that the purpose of neighborhood commercial should be oriented slightly more towards that commercial element. That is key in the purpose of neighborhood commercial. Mixing in residential on top of that is okay if there are reasonable parameters on it, and as long as there's that established commercial element there. So what we've done is kind of clean up some of the residential specific uses elsewhere in that use list. Those being bed and breakfast, home occupations and preschools, planned unit developments, residential facilities for elderly persons, and then live work spaces. I will caveat 2 of these, or at least one of these. Home occupations can come back as an element of a mixed use project, in the residential component of a mixed use project. If someone wants to get a home business license, that's fine, as long as that is not what they're using for the commercial element. And then we would propose amending the following existing use. We would replace mixed residential housing, which is defined, but pretty weakly defined in the neighborhood commercial zone, as neighborhood mixed use. And this neighborhood mixed use type would become a replacement for all these other random residential uses. So if you wanted a residential component in a neighborhood commercial development, you would go through the neighborhood mixed use process. What that would do would add an allowance for residential housing, but only as a component of a neighborhood mixed use development application. We've then created a draft definition for that, but separated out the actual development standards to be codified within the neighborhood commercial zoning chapter rather than regulating by definition. The draft definition is very similar to actually to the residential mixed housing definition that exists, but a single building containing more than one land use, at least one of which is residential, or a single development of more than one building in use, one of which is residential, where the different types of land uses are in close proximity, planned as a complementary whole, and functionally integrated to the use of shared vehicular and pedestrian access and parking areas. So vertical mixed use or horizontal mixed use, as long as all the elements of a horizontal mixed use project, you know, the buildings don't have to be connected, but they're part of the same project. Very similar to actually our, you know, our town center concept, where not all those buildings are going to be vertical mixed use, but it is one project with multiple uses within the project. And then some draft standards for that neighborhood mixed use type. All neighborhood commercial development standards pertaining to building height, setbacks, landscaping, coverage, parking, you know, all those things would continue to apply. The ordinance does a pretty good job of designating what those standards are. We don't see a real reason to have to revisit any of those and modify those. And that includes a greater setback when you're adjacent to residential, smaller setback if you're adjacent to another commercial use. So there's some good tools built in there. And then we've stated here, the mix of uses shall be consistent with the permitted and conditional uses listed in the neighborhood commercial chapter. They're all conditional right now. Hopefully one day we'll change that, but basically you can mix the uses. You have a residential component, but the non-residential component has to be one of those other uses listed in the zone. And then this is what we talked about last time. That was in the definition. We've just pulled that out and made it a standard. The non-residential portion of a neighborhood mixed-use project shall constitute a minimum of 25% of the total gross floor area of the entire unit or project square footage. And then at least 50% of the unit or project frontage at ground level along a public right-of-way is dedicated to the non-residential portion of the project. So the commercial element is oriented to the public right-of-way. I think that's kind of part of that purpose statement, neighborhood commercial. So requiring a minimum amount of non-residential, and then that amount has to be focused on the public right-of-way, seems to achieve the goals of that chapter pretty well. And then while not directly a result of the moratorium or the live work space reconfiguration, there are a few things we've gone in and also recommended cleaning up right now. One is modifying the minimum lot size standards. Right now, you have to have 7,000 square feet with a minimum lot width of 60 feet and a minimum lot depth of 90 feet. You know, a neat, tidy rectangle. That's a little bit problematic in a property like, even like the Smith Shopping Center, when, you know, that's one big project, but they go and subdivide that randomly for ownership reasons and put cross access over it. And these lot standards technically apply. So we've seen these cohesive projects have to go in and create these really funky, arbitrary, you know, lot standards or lot size dimensions to be able to comply with that. It's much easier in staff's opinion to require no minimum lot size or dimensional requirements, provided that all applicable development standards are met. There's a lot of them in this zone. You know, you've got setbacks and open space and parking and buffering and you know, lot coverage and all these things, and aggregating all those things together is typically going to result in, you know, a development that is within the context and scale of the property that it's proposing to develop. And then modifying the height requirements. It currently states the maximum height is 2 stories or 35 feet, whichever is less. We're recommending streamlining that, worrying less about the number of stories and more about just that maximum visual impact. Again, if you have 3 shorter stories, that's going to change parking standards and other site improvements. As long as that maximum height is 35 feet or less, I'm not sure we're as concerned with whether that's 1 or 2 or 3 stories as much as we are. Does this meet all the other development standards? So that's the proposed version 2 of this amendment. This is not on for action tonight, but I wanted to bring this in front of you for discussion, for feedback, and then our plan would be to bring this back as an actual proposed ordinance amendment in June.
Great work on
Yeah.
putting this together.
Much better. Wow.
Couple questions.
Yes.
Does this kick, so any of the developments under the live, or not even live work, but neighborhood commercial, is it going to kick it into the commercial code for every project that's going to be in neighborhood commercial, or is IRC going to be applicable?
Depends, I think. live work space did trigger commercial code standards. So if it's an integrated mixed use building, that's probably gonna be a commercial building standard. If it's a development where it's different phases of the development, you've got commercial in the front and residential in the back. There may be some opportunity that the residential standalone component of a neighborhood mixed use project could be an IRC building type. But anything that's attached mixed use, I believe would require commercial code compliance.
Right. How does the staff feel about the definition of the new code? I guess the neighborhood
Yeah.
mixed use.
I think based on the great feedback from the commission, the public comments, and even, feedback from the council, we took this draft to council last night just to update them on where we were and where this was in the process. It seemed like the main intention with the neighborhood commercial zone was not a residential zoning tool with a little bit of commercial. It was a neighborhood scale commercial zoning tool that, if done right, could incorporate some residential into it. And we think this accomplishes that, while still respecting all those neighborhood commercial development standards, setbacks from residential areas and that kind of thing.
I love that it's added some flexibility. I appreciate the dimension exceptions and the fact that you're thoughtful about what currently exists and seeing how we can make progress on those to give developers some flexibility and some opportunity.
Sure.
And helping to clarify what we're after so that and I don't like to think of it as closing loopholes as much as just helping to shine a light on what we're looking for in some of these
Sure.
areas. It's really hard, I think, for developers when it turns into a game of guess what we're thinking. And sometimes they guess right, or sometimes it appears that they're fudging the rules. And I don't know if they're always intending to fudge the rules. They're just trying to figure out something that will work for the space.
Of course.
I hope this will give them flexibility with these little neighborhood commercial pieces. I hate to see them go away. I mean, Commissioner Steinman pointed that out, and that's really resonated with me, that there's not a lot of them. And
Right.
they could be highly, highly valuable to kind of helping to contribute to the neighborhood feel in all these little pockets.
Yeah.
I love the revisions. I think it adds a lot to, like you said, for builders and just clarify. Again, we don't want to very clarified, but clarifying. I mean, it's clear for sure.
I heard your presentation last night and you did mention your hope that we would put some permitted uses in this zone. I just want to second that thought, that a zone with no permitted uses is a burden to everyone who wants to develop in it. And if you extrapolate from what the following proposal brought forward, he spent probably 40 grand, excuse me, 40 grand in the little guesswork game. And all for naught, really.
Sure.
So if the more clarity we can give, and by that some permitted uses, I think the better off we are, and we make it for those people who are trying to develop.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a tricky one. It's certainly, I tend to think zoning should have some permitted uses, even if, like residential office, the only permitted use is residential. And then if you want to build commercial, you go through the conditional use process, but at least there's a base, permitted entitlement there. At the same time, I kind of want to wait and see where, town center is a big neighborhood commercial piece. That's a city project, so it's a little unique. And then a lot of our other neighborhood commercial land is within where we've proposed the form-based code apply. So if that's approved and adopted, then we have a few little pockets of neighborhood commercial left over. In my opinion, that would be the time to come in and assess. Okay, these areas are probably always going to be this neighborhood commercial use. Let's go in and figure out what uses need additional input and scrutiny and which ones might not. So that, maybe a phase 2 of this effort. Unless the planning commission has suggestions as part of this for which uses could kick up into permitted uses, and then certainly we could pass that along to the city council and, try that now.
I think where we're at now is good. Maybe phase 2 is looking at permitted uses and let's get this finalized. And, is there any kind of deadline in terms of, I mean, I know there's the moratorium.
Yeah.
That's kind of the imposed deadline, and
Yeah.
that's August.
That's August. Typically we try to not drag that on if we don't need to, but we have until mid-August before that moratorium lifts again.
Okay.
It's a pretty narrowly focused, it only limits live workspaces. Everything else that's in there today is, someone could come in and make an application.
All right. It's great. I love the changes, so thank you. Anything else we want to talk about in the last
Right on top.
minutes? No? Okay,
Motion to adjourn.
I will second that.
okay, thank you. Commissioner Stunman and Commissioner Smith, second. All in favor?
Uh,
Any opposed?